The gun was already out of the holster before George Slater even finished asking his question. He had ridden into the yard of the Lockhart property with nothing more than a dry throat and a sun-cracked map that had been useless to him for the better part of 3 days. He had expected to find a farmhand, maybe a drowsy old rancher willing to point a finger westward toward the town of Redemption, Nevada. What he had not expected was the woman standing on the porch with a Winchester rifle aimed directly at the center of his chest, her dark eyes blazing with something that was not fear, not even close to fear, but a cold and absolute fury that told him she had been lied to before and had no intention of being lied to again. "You ride for Callum Briggs," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was low and controlled and more dangerous for it. George's hands went up slowly, the reins looped over his left wrist. He kept his palms flat and open, facing her. "Ma'am, I don't know who Callum Briggs is." "That is exactly what the last one said before he tried to burn my barn." The rifle did not waver. She was perhaps 26, 27 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned back in a practical knot that the August wind was working loose strand by strand. There was a smear of flour across her left cheekbone, as though she had been interrupted mid-task, and the apron tied around her waist was the apron of a woman who had been in the middle of her own life when his intrusion had pulled her out of it. But the rifle, the way she held it, the way her shoulder was braced for the recoil and her finger rested with confident familiarity on the trigger guard, that was not the posture of a woman who had never fired. "I stopped to ask directions," George said carefully. "To Redemption. My map says the creek bends east here, but I haven't found a creek in 2 days of riding." Something flickered across her face, not softness, more like the recalculation a chess player makes when the board shifts unexpectedly. "Creek dried up 4 summers ago," she said. "Redemption is 11 miles due north. Follow the ridgeline, stay left of the 2 red rocks that look like a man sitting. Don't stop at the Haverson place, they'll rob you and call it hospitality." She gave him that direction with the rifle still up. He should have thanked her, wheeled his horse and ridden north. He should have taken that single direction and put it between himself and everything that was about to change his life. He was a drifter. He had been drifting for 4 years. He was good at leaving. He was, in fact, one of the finest practitioners of leaving that the American West had ever produced. He did not leave. Because she lowered the rifle exactly 1 inch, and in that 1 inch he saw what the fury had been covering, the way a winter coat covers the fact that the person inside it is shaking. He saw exhaustion so profound it was nearly physical, and beneath that, a fear she was far too proud to speak aloud. And George Slater, who had spent 4 years convincing himself that other people's troubles were other people's problems, felt something lock into place inside his chest like a bolt sliding home into iron. "You're in trouble," he said, not as an accusation, almost gently. The rifle came back up. "Ride north, mister. My name is George Slater. I used to be a deputy marshal out of Abilene, Kansas." He kept his hands up. "Before that I was a lot of things, none of them especially admirable. But right now I'm a man with 2 good hands and no particular place to be for the next little while, and it looks to me like you could use someone who isn't afraid of Callum Briggs." The silence that fell between them was so complete he could hear the dry grass crackling in the wind and the nervous stamp of his horse's left foreleg. Fannie Lockhart stared at him for a long time. Then she said, "Get off your horse. I'll make coffee. You so much as reach for that sidearm and I'll bury you next to the fence post where the last one is." George dismounted very slowly, wondering with genuine curiosity whether there was actually someone buried next to the fence post. He decided, looking at her face, that there probably was. That had been the beginning. That had been 4 months ago, and now, standing in the same yard in the amber light of a December afternoon in 1878, George Slater understood that he was more thoroughly, hopelessly, irreversibly in love with Fannie Lockhart than he had ever been with anything in his 4 years of wandering, and that the 11 miles to Redemption might as well have been 11,000 because he was not going to walk them. He was not going to ride them. He was not going anywhere at all. But first, there was still Callum Briggs to deal with, and Callum Briggs had just sent a letter. Fannie had come to this land in 1875, 3 years before George arrived in her yard. She had come with her husband, Thomas Lockhart, a quiet and methodical man from Ohio who had believed in Nevada homestead land with the faith of a convert. They had filed their claim on 240 acres of high desert scrubland outside Redemption, and Thomas had spent 2 years transforming it into something that worked. He had built the main house from lumber hauled 40 miles by wagon. He had dug a well that actually held water. He had planted apple trees along the south fence that everyone said would never survive the altitude, and 2 of them had survived and produced fruit the size of his fist. Thomas had died in the spring of 1877 from a rattlesnake bite that went bad. He had been checking the fence line on the eastern property when it happened, and by the time Fannie found him and got him back to the house, the infection had taken hold. He had lasted 4 days. He had told her to sell the land and go back east, and she had held his hand and listened and known that she was not going to do any such thing. Because Thomas had loved this land and she had come to love it too, and because selling would mean selling to Callum Briggs, who had made Thomas a low offer the week before he died, which Fannie had never been able to stop thinking about. Callum Briggs was 43 years old and had come to Nevada in the early 1870s with capital from a railroad family back east and a specific talent for acquiring land that other people had worked and bled over. He owned most of the grazing land in the valley below the Lockhart property, and he needed the Lockhart land because the water rights on Fannie's claim were the key to expanding his herd north of the ridge. Without those water rights, his cattle would not make it through a dry summer. With them, he could double his operation and sell beef contracts to the Army outpost at Fort Churchill. Fannie knew all of this. She had figured it out herself, methodically, the way Thomas had taught her to figure things, by sitting down with a pencil and a piece of paper and working it through until the lines connected. And what the lines told her was that her land was not just valuable to Callum Briggs, it was essential, which meant that as long as she held it, she had power she did not realize she had, and which Briggs could not afford to let her keep. The first attempt to drive her off had been subtle. A letter from a lawyer in Carson City claiming that Thomas's original land filing had an error in the survey description that made the claim contestable. Fannie had ridden to Carson City herself, a 2-day trip, and spent 4 days in the county record's office until she found the original survey and proved the filing was correct. The second attempt had been the offer, low, insulting, delivered by a man in a clean suit who had looked around her kitchen with barely concealed contempt. She had handed the offer back without looking at the number. The third attempt had been the barn fire. It had not destroyed the barn because she had been awake that night, had heard something she could not explain, and had gone out with her rifle and found a man with a tin of coal oil. The fire had not been lit. The man had left, quickly, in the direction she had suggested with the barrel of her Winchester. After that, she had started sleeping with the rifle beside the bed. And then, in August of 1878, a stranger had ridden into her yard and asked directions. George tied his horse to the post near the water trough and followed Fannie Lockhart into her kitchen, and the first thing he noticed was that the kitchen was organized with a precision that spoke of a mind accustomed to managing complexity. The second thing he noticed was that there were 3 different lists tacked to the wall beside the stove, written in a small, confident hand. A list of what needed doing this week, a list of what needed doing before winter, and a third list at the bottom that he read twice before he understood it was a list of everything Callum Briggs had done to her, dated and described in plain language. "You keep records," he said. "I keep everything," she said. She set a pot on the cast iron stove with the efficiency of someone who had made coffee 10,000 times alone. "You said you were a deputy marshal." "Was," he said. "Present tense is just a man. Why'd you stop?" The question was direct enough that he answered it directly. I was stationed in Abilene. There was a situation involving a man who had connections to people above my station. He had done something that deserved a cell, and instead he got a handshake, and I got my badge handed back to me. He paused. I made some choices after that which I am not proud of. Then I started moving and didn't stop. She poured the water into the pot and looked at him across the kitchen with those steady, dark eyes. What choices? Nothing that put anyone in the ground who didn't earn it, he said carefully. She appeared to consider this for a moment. Then she said, Callum Briggs has 3 men who rotate through. One of them is named Decker. He's the one who tries to look friendly. Don't let him look friendly at you. One is named Horace. He does what he's told and doesn't think about it. The third one changes. I don't always know who it is. Briggs himself never comes to the property. He sends the men and stays in town and keeps his hands clean. George set his hat on the table. How much land? 240 acres. The water rights on the eastern section are what he wants. How long have you been fighting him alone? She was quiet for a moment. She poured the coffee and set his cup down and sat across the table from him in the chair that had been Thomas's chair, though George did not know that yet, and she held her own cup in both hands the way people do when they need something warm to hold on to. 17 months, she said. He looked at her steadily. She met his look without flinching. That is a long time to be alone, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He stayed that night, sleeping in the barn because it was the only proper thing and because she did not invite him into the house. And in the morning he found that he had gotten up early and done the fence repair he had noticed was needed along the south line. And when she came out with the morning and found it done, she stood looking at it for a long time. You don't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. The fence was broken. She looked at him and he looked back, and something passed between them that was not romance yet, was nowhere close to romance yet, but was the thing that comes before romance when two people who have learned to be careful begin to decide whether they are going to be careful around each other. I'll pay you for your time, she said. I'm not working for money, he said. Then what are you working for? He picked up the hammer and the remaining wire and looked out over the land in the early morning light, the red rocks on the ridge, the thin blue strip of far sky, the apple trees his horse had been investigating, and he said, I don't know yet, but I'll tell you when I figure it out. He stayed the second day because the roof on the chicken coop needed work. He stayed the third day because he found that the well casing was cracked, and if it went unrepaired before the cold set in it would cause serious trouble. Fannie watched him work with an expression he couldn't read, and in the evenings she fed him at the table and they talked, carefully at first and then less carefully, because he asked questions that weren't invasive but were genuinely curious, and she had not been genuinely asked about in a long time. She told him about Thomas. She did not cry when she told him, but her voice changed, went careful and deliberate, the way you speak around a bruise. He listened without rushing her or offering comfort she hadn't asked for, and when she finished she looked surprised, the way people do when they realize they have said more than they intended. I have talked more in the last 3 evenings than I have in the last year, she said. You have a lot to say, he said. Most people do when someone is quiet enough to let them. She looked at him across the table. You are a strange kind of drifter, George Slater. Most drifters are strange in one way or another. That's generally why they drift. What's your reason? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, after Abilene, I told myself I was moving because there was nothing worth staying for. After a while, moving becomes its own habit. You forget what you were looking for in the first place. What were you looking for? He met her eyes. I'm starting to think I might have found it by accident. The color that came into her face was not embarrassment but something more complex and guarded, and she looked away first, which was the only time in the weeks he had known her that she looked away first. She said, You can sleep in the spare room. It's warmer than the barn. The spare room was Thomas's study, and it still had his books on the shelf and his writing box on the desk, and George moved into it with the respectful care of a man who understood what he was being trusted with. He did not rearrange anything. He simply added himself to the room as carefully as he could. September came, and with September came the first real visit from Decker. Decker rode up to the property line on a Tuesday morning, which was specific enough to be intentional, because Fannie always went to Redemption on Tuesdays to trade eggs and get supplies, and Decker would have known that. What Decker did not know was that George was there. Fannie had not gone to town that morning because the mare had thrown a shoe. She was in the yard when Decker came down the track, and George came around from the east side of the house, not quite between them but close enough. Decker was perhaps 35, with a pleasant face and the specific kind of smile that is laid over something unpleasant the way wallpaper is laid over cracked plaster. He tipped his hat to Fannie and pretended not to see George for a moment before turning to look at him with mild curiosity. "Didn't know you had company, Mrs. Lockhart," he said. "Mr. Slater is helping me with some property maintenance," Fannie said. Her voice was calm and pleasant and entirely closed. Decker looked at George with a more careful kind of assessment. "New to the area. Passing through," George said. Then he looked directly at Decker and said, slowly. There was a beat of silence in which both men understood each other perfectly, and in which Decker revised his expectations for whatever conversation he had come to have. "Mr. Briggs wanted to pass along his regards to Mrs. Lockhart," Decker said, back to Fannie. "He understands these past months have been difficult for a woman on her own. He wants her to know his offer still stands, and he'd be happy to make it a little more generous given the circumstances." "Please tell Mr. Briggs I appreciate his concern," Fannie said with perfect composure. "My circumstances are quite well managed. Give him my regards." Decker's pleasant smile didn't change. Looked at George once more, that careful, assessing look. "You plan to be in the area long, Mr. Slater?" "As long as it takes," George said. After Decker left, Fannie leaned against the fence post and let out a breath that was long and slow and contained something that might, in a person less controlled, have been a tremor. "He'll go back and tell Briggs," she said. "Good," George said. "Let him think twice." She looked at him sideways. "You realize this puts you in the middle of something that isn't yours. You gave me a direction and a room and 3 weeks of honest company," he said. "That makes it mine enough." Something in her expression shifted, that guarded thing loosening by a fraction, a degree, just enough that he could see through it to what was underneath. And what was underneath was a woman who had been carrying an enormous weight by herself, and was cautiously, suspiciously, hopefully wondering if she might be allowed to put a portion of it down. October in Nevada turned the air to glass, cold and clear and brilliant, and the work on the property continued. George proved to be competent with horses and fences and basic carpentry, and entirely useless with baking, which Fannie discovered when she left him to monitor the bread one afternoon and came back to find he had let it burn while reading one of Thomas's books on land law, which he had apparently found more interesting than the bread. "Thomas used to do that with books," she said, scraping the bottom of the loaf with a knife. There was nothing in her voice that indicated grief, only a rueful kind of recognition. "I would come back and find him 3 chapters deep and whatever was on the stove ruined." "What did he read?" George asked, looking up from the land law volume. "Everything," she said. "History, agriculture, philosophy. He believed that a man should understand the world he lived in." She paused. "He would have liked you, I think. He always said the most interesting men were the ones who didn't realize they were interesting." George set the book down. "You miss him very much." "Every day," she said simply, "but it changes. The first year I missed him so hard it was like missing air. Now I miss him the way you miss a season. It was real. It mattered. It's past." He looked at her for a long time. She was at the counter with the ruined bread, and the afternoon light came through the window and caught the copper in her hair, and she was not looking at him. And George Slater, who had been many things and had been none of them well except perhaps careful, thought that he was going to have to be more careful than he had ever been in his life, because this woman deserved nothing that was not entirely true. "Fannie," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She had been Mrs. Lockhart for 2 months. She went still at the counter. "I want to tell you something honestly," he said, "and I'd like you to hear it without reaching for the rifle." A beat of silence. Then she turned and looked at him with those steady dark eyes and said, "Tell me." "I have not wanted to be anywhere," he said, "in 4 years. I have ridden through some of the most beautiful country on this continent and felt nothing about any of it except that it was behind me. I want to be here. I do not know exactly what that means yet, and I am not going to pretend it means something I can't back up. But I thought you should know." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light held very still. "That is an honest thing to say," she said. "I'm trying to practice honesty," he said. "I find it harder than fence repair." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the beginning of one, the sketch of one, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in 4 years of riding. "Go fix the fence on the north line," she said. "I'll make something that isn't bread." He went. He fixed the fence. He was smiling the entire time, and he was glad there was nobody to see it. That was October. November brought the first cold, and with it, news from Redemption that shifted everything. He heard it from the blacksmith in town, a man named Arlo Crane, who had the particular wisdom of men who work with their hands and say very little until they say something important. George had ridden in to pick up supplies, and Arlo had looked at him carefully across the anvil and said, "You riding for the Lockhart widow?" "I'm working her property," George said carefully. "Word is Briggs has put a filing in at the county seat," Arlo said, "contesting the water rights on a technicality. Something about the original survey not meeting the '73 Homestead Act specifications. Claims the boundary description is invalid." George set down the bag of nails he had been examining. "Can he do that?" "A man with a lawyer and money can try most things," Arlo said. "Whether it holds is another question, but even if it doesn't hold, the legal process takes time and money. Widow with a property running alone doesn't always have both." He paused. "She deserves better than what he's doing to her." "She does," George said. He rode back to the property with the supplies and a cold determination that sat in his chest like a stone, and he told Fannie what Arlo had said, plainly and without softening it, because she deserved the truth at full strength. She was quiet while he told her. Then she went to the writing box in the study and took out the land papers and spread them on the kitchen table, and they looked at them together in the lamplight. George had been reading Thomas's land law book, which had not been entirely accidental, and he found the relevant section of the Homestead Act of 1862, which governed the original filing. "The original survey uses the creek bed as the eastern boundary marker," he said. "The creek that dried up," she said. "In 1873 the creek was there," he said. "The filing was made in 1875 and the creek was still there." Briggs's argument is that the survey description references the creek as a permanent feature, and since it's no longer there, the boundary is invalid. He read further. "That's wrong. The survey also references 3 fixed stone markers at the corner points. 2 of them are still there. One might be," he looked up. "We need to find that 3rd marker." "Thomas set those markers himself," she said. "He described the locations in his journals." She was up before he had finished the sentence, going to the shelf in the study, pulling down a battered leather-bound book. She found the entry in minutes, her finger running down the page, Thomas's handwriting beneath her hand. "Northeast corner," she read. 14 feet south-southwest of the rock formation I've taken to calling the old man because of the silhouette. Stone marker set 3 feet into the ground, flat limestone cap. Initials TL carved on the south face." George looked at her. "You know where the old man formation is?" "I have walked every inch of this property," she said. "I know exactly where it is." They rode out the next morning in the cold blue light of a November dawn, following the line of the property to the northeast corner, where a cluster of boulders stood against the ridge, in a formation that did, with some imagination, suggest the silhouette of a seated figure. George dismounted and measured 14 feet south-southwest by eye and instinct, and then he started clearing the frost-hardened brush with the flat of his boot. He found the marker at just over a foot down, a limestone slab with a rough TL cut into the south face, exactly as Thomas had described it. Fannie knelt beside it and put her hand on the carved initials and was silent for a moment that George gave her completely, stepping back and looking at the ridge and the sky and the land and giving her the privacy of the moment. Then she stood and her face was composed and clear. "We document this," she said. "Measurements from the other two markers. Photographs if we can get a camera from Redemption. We get this to a lawyer before Briggs's filing can be heard." "There's a land lawyer in Carson City," George said. "Woman named Helena Marsh. Arlo mentioned her. She has a reputation for not taking cases she can't win." Fannie looked at him steadily. "How do you know the right people in a place you've been for 3 months?" "I listen," he said simply. "People say useful things if you listen long enough." They rode to Carson City the following week. It was a long 2-day ride, and they covered the first day in focused near silence, the cold pressing around them, the horses steady on the road. They stopped at a way station at nightfall where there were 2 rooms available, and George paid for both without discussion, and Fannie did not comment on it. In the morning over breakfast at the station's small dining table, she looked at him across the coffee cups and said, "I want to ask you something personal." "All right," he said. "Do you have anyone, somewhere, someone who is waiting for you?" He was quiet for a moment, understanding the weight of the question, the particular courage it took her to ask it. "No," he said. "There was someone in Abilene a long time ago. It didn't survive what happened there. There has been no one since." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "I'm not in a hurry for anything. I want you to know that. I'm not asking because I want something immediate. I'm asking because I want to know who you are." "I understand," he said. "I want you to know who I am too. I'm still working out some of the details." She almost smiled. "So am I," she said. "After Thomas died, I thought I knew exactly who I was. Then I realized I had been so much his partner for so long that I had to learn some of it again." "What have you learned?" he asked. She thought about it. Outside, the winter light was thin and pale, and they were 2 people on the road between a life being defended and the people who might help defend it, and it was one of those mornings that later become monuments in the geography of a life. "I learned that I am braver than I thought," she said, "and lonelier than I wanted to be, and that the loneliness and the bravery are connected, because you can only find out what you're made of when there is no one else to rely on." "That's true," he said. "But I also think," she said more slowly, "that being brave alone is not the same as being strong, and that strength, real strength, might have more to do with letting people in than with keeping them out." She said it looking at her coffee cup, and he looked at her profile against the pale winter window, and the stone in his chest became something warm and heavy and entirely welcome. Helena Marsh was everything Arlo Crane had suggested. A compact, sharp-eyed woman of perhaps 50 who had practiced land law in Nevada since the early 70s and who looked at Fannie's documents. The photographs George had arranged to have taken of all 3 stone markers, the journal entries, and the original land filing with an attention that was pure and focused and impressed. "He's filing on the creek boundary argument," she said, turning a page. "It's thin. Courts have generally held that fixed survey markers supersede natural feature references when both exist. You have all 3 markers. You have documentation of their placement in the original survey. You have the journal record from the individual who set them." She looked at Fannie. "His filing is going to fail, Mrs. Lockhart. The question is how long you need to hold on while the process plays out." "How long?" Fannie asked. 3 to 6 months at the county level, possibly a hearing in the spring." "Can he make it harder in the meantime?" Helena Marsh set down the papers. "He can make it expensive. He can make it inconvenient. He can put pressure on from various directions." She paused. "I'll take your case. My rate is fair, and if it goes to hearing, I will represent you." Fannie extended her hand, and Helena Marsh shook it with the firmness of a woman who had conducted all her business with both hands open and both eyes clear. On the road back to the property, the second evening, they stopped at the same way station. After supper, George walked out onto the narrow porch of the station to look at the stars, which were extraordinary out here in the high desert, enormous and cold and numberless, and Fannie came and stood beside him without a word. They stood in the cold together looking at the sky, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her arm against his. "George," she said. "Yes. Thank you." She paused. "I want to say that clearly, not as a courtesy. You came into my yard and I put a rifle on you and you could have ridden north and had nothing more to do with any of this. You stayed. You have given 4 months of your life to something that isn't yours. I told you in October," he said quietly. "It became mine." She turned to look at him in the starlight and her face was open in a way he had not seen before, the guards down, the calculated composure set aside, just her face and the truth in it. He understood that she was trusting him with something more fragile and more precious than her land documents. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like it to be yours, properly, if you are willing." He turned to face her fully. He was very still. "Are you saying what I think you're saying, Fannie?" "I am saying," she said, with the directness that was one of the things he loved most about her, "that I do not want you to be passing through anymore. I would like you to be staying." She held his gaze steadily. "If that is something you want." He reached out and took her hand and held it between both of his. Her hand was strong, the hand of a woman who had worked and held on, and he held it with the care he would have given something irreplaceable. "I stopped drifting the day I rode into your yard," he said. "I just didn't know how to say it until right now." She breathed out slowly and turned back to the stars, her hand still in his. They stood there for a long time, two people on a cold porch in Nevada in November of 1878, holding on. December came in cold and brilliant, and the property work continued, and the days had a different quality now, the way days do when something has been named between two people and the naming has made it real. Fannie had always been self-contained, but now there was a warmth beneath the self-containment that surfaced in moments over the supper table, when she brought him coffee in the early morning without asking if he wanted it because she already knew, when he said something that caught her off guard and she laughed, an unexpected laugh, quick and genuine and unguarded. He loved that laugh. He cataloged it like a valuable thing. And then the letter came from Callum Briggs. It arrived on a Thursday in early December, delivered by a boy from Redemption who looked nervous about delivering it and left quickly. Fannie read it at the kitchen table while George was outside, and when he came in, she handed it to him without a word. The letter was from Briggs directly, which was unusual. It was polite in the way that a weapon is polite before it is used. It said that he had become aware of the legal challenge to his county filing, and that he respected Mrs. Lockhart's determination, and that he wanted to offer, before the matter went further, a final private negotiation. He proposed a meeting in Redemption at the Northern Star Hotel on Friday the 13th of December, at noon. He said he believed they could come to an arrangement that served both parties. He said he came in good faith. George read it twice. "He doesn't come in good faith," he said. "No," Fannie agreed, "but I want to hear what he says." "Fannie, George," she looked at him steadily, "this is my land, my fight. I have been running it for 17 months before you came along, and I am not going to hand the decisions over now." A pause. "But I would like you to come with me." "I was going to insist on it," he said. "Were you?" Very politely. The corner of her mouth moved. "All right," she said. "We go together." Redemption in December was a different kind of town than its summer self. The dust was down, the streets quieter, a thin coat of frost on the boardwalks in the morning. The Northern Star Hotel was the best building in town, which was not saying much, but it had glass in all its windows and a dining room that served actual food. Callum Briggs was already there when they arrived. He was not what George had expected, which was always how it worked with men who were dangerous because of their money rather than their fists. Briggs was perhaps 43, with a well-fed look and a gray suit that was slightly too good for Nevada, and a manner that was practiced in the specific courtesy that is meant to disarm. He stood when Fannie entered, which was the correct thing to do, and he looked at George with a rapid calculation before extending his hand. George shook it. He had a good handshake and he made it neither too firm nor too easy, and Briggs seemed to register both the greeting and the assessment. They sat. Briggs ordered coffee, and a slight frown crossed his face at the quality of the pot, but he said nothing about it. "Mrs. Lockhart," he said, "I appreciate you coming. I know the ride from the property isn't easy in December." "It's fine," Fannie said. She had her hands folded on the table and her back was straight, and she was wearing a dark blue dress that was not her best dress but was dignified, and she looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had held on through 17 months of pressure and intended to keep holding. "I'll be direct," Briggs said. He glanced at George. "I don't know Mr. Slater's stake in this." "He is here with me," Fannie said. "That's sufficient." Briggs accepted this with a slight nod. "I want the water rights on your eastern section. I'm prepared to offer you a price for those rights alone, not the full property, that would allow you to retain the land and still have enough capital to operate comfortably for several years. It would be a fair sum." He named a figure. It was, George noted, genuinely substantial. Not an insult this time. Fannie looked at the figure on the paper Briggs pushed across the table. She did not touch the paper. "If I sell you the water rights on the eastern section," she said, "what happens to my cattle in a dry summer when I need that water?" "We could structure an access arrangement," Briggs began. "That you control," Fannie said, "and can revoke." A pause. "I understand your concern," Briggs said. "Do you understand?" Fannie said with the quiet and direct force that George had come to recognize as her particular power, "that I am not going to sell anything. I am going to win the legal case because my survey markers are intact and documented, and the law is clear. I am going to hold this property. I am going to continue to hold it. And I would like you to stop sending men to my property at night with coal oil." The silence at the table was absolute. Briggs's expression did not change in any large way. It was the small changes that George noted, the slight tightening around the eyes, the fractional set of the jaw, the moment in which the practiced courtesy was recalculated. "I don't know what you're referring to," Briggs said. "Yes," Fannie said pleasantly, "you do." Another silence. Briggs picked up his coffee cup. "You are a very determined woman, Mrs. Lockhart," he said, with something that was almost admiration, but was actually the sound a man makes when he is changing his strategy. "I am," she said. "I'll thank you for the coffee." She stood. George stood with her. They walked out of the Northern Star Hotel into the December morning, and Fannie did not speak until they were at the horses, and then she turned to George with an expression that was part fury and part something that looked very much like exhilaration. "He'll go harder now," she said. "Probably," George agreed. "He knows the legal case won't work. He'll try something else." "What?" George looked down the street toward the hotel. "Something that looks legitimate, something with an official face on it. He has contacts at the county seat and possibly in Carson City. He'll look for a different angle." "What do we do?" "We stay ahead of it," he said. "Helena Marsh needs to know what happened in that meeting, and I need to write to someone I know in Abilene who might know something about Briggs's background. Men like that have histories." She looked at him. "You have connections in Abilene." "I have a former colleague. We parted ways, but not badly. He owes me a favor or two." He paused. "His name is Ernest Doyle. He's a good man. He knows people who know things." "Then write to him," Fannie said. They rode back to the property through the cold December afternoon, and that evening George wrote 2 letters, one to Helena Marsh detailing the meeting and Briggs's veiled acknowledgement, and one to Ernest Doyle in Abilene, asking for whatever Doyle could find out about Callum Briggs's business dealings in Nevada and elsewhere. 3 weeks passed. Christmas came quietly to the Lockhart property. Fannie did not make a ceremony of it, but she made a meal that was considerably better than usual, and there were 2 small packages on the table when George came in from the morning work, one with his name on it. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I wanted to," she said simply. The package contained a pair of leather gloves, the good kind, properly stitched, sized correctly for his hands. He looked up at her, and she was at the stove, not looking at him. "You measured," he said. "You left a glove on the fence post last week," she said with careful unconcern. He went and kissed her on the cheek, which was the first time he had kissed her in any way, and she went very still under his lips, and then her hand came up and covered his where it rested on her shoulder, warm and sure. "Merry Christmas, Fannie," he said quietly. "Merry Christmas, George," she said. They sat by the fireplace that evening and she read to him from one of Thomas's books, a history of the great overland routes, and he listened to her voice in the firelight and thought that this was what peace felt like, actual peace, the kind that is not the absence of trouble but the presence of something worth protecting. Ernest Doyle's letter arrived in the second week of January, 1879. George read it at the kitchen table with Fannie beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. Doyle had been thorough. He had contacts in 3 territories, and he had used all of them. What he had found was not surprising, but was exactly what they needed. Callum Briggs had been involved in a land dispute in Utah Territory in 1869 that had resulted in a civil judgment against him for coercive practices. The judgment had been appealed and eventually overturned on a procedural technicality, but the record existed. In 1872, a homesteader in western Nevada named Anders Holm had sold his property to Briggs after what the county records described as a protracted dispute over a water access agreement. Exactly the same kind of arrangement Briggs had proposed to Fannie. Holm had sold for significantly below market value and had left the territory. Doyle had tracked Holm down in Oregon and written to him, and Holm had written back with a statement that described intimidation, property damage, and specific threats that had driven him off his land. It was a pattern. "Helena Marsh needs all of this," Fannie said. "Yes," George said, "and so does someone at the Nevada Territorial Office. If Briggs has a history of this in multiple territories, it changes the legal character of what he's doing to you." "It's not just a business dispute," Fannie said slowly. "It's a systematic practice, which makes it something the territorial government has an interest in," George said. "Men like Briggs operate because no one connects the incidents. Each victim handles it alone, each case looks isolated." Fannie was very still. "Anders Holm handled it alone," she said. "Yes. And sold. Yes." The silence in the kitchen was the particular silence of a person understanding something about their own situation more clearly, and in it George saw the complicated thing that passed over her face. The awareness that she had nearly been home, that without the dried creek, the legal filing, the fight, and yes, the company of a drifter who had happened to ask directions, she might have been worn down to the same point. "This does not happen to anyone else after me," she said, quietly but with complete finality. "No," George agreed, "it doesn't." They wrote to Helena Marsh that day with all of Doyle's findings, and the following week George rode to Carson City alone with the documents, because Fannie needed to stay with the property, and he was beginning to know that road well enough to make it in a day and a half. Helena Marsh read the documents and looked at George for a long moment across her desk. "This changes the case substantially," she said. "How substantially?" "I can take this to the territorial attorney's office as a pattern of practice. If they open an inquiry, Briggs's county filing becomes the least of his problems." She paused. "It also means he'll know the game has changed. He may become more aggressive before he becomes less so." "That's what I expect," George said. "You're prepared for that?" George thought of Fannie on her porch with the Winchester. He thought of her at the kitchen table with the list of everything Briggs had done. He thought of her hand over his at Christmas. "She's been prepared for it for 17 months, he said. "She's not alone now." He rode back to the property in the January cold, arriving after dark, and Fannie was still up, the lamp burning in the kitchen. She heard the horse and came to the door, and when she saw him ride in, she crossed her arms against the cold and waited, and he could see from 50 feet away the tension in her shoulders that loosened when she recognized him. He put the horse in the barn and came up to the porch, and her face asked the question before she did. "Helena is taking it to the territorial office," he said. "It's going to be all right." Fannie let out a long breath that misted in the cold air. "Come inside," she said. "There's supper." He came inside, and she set the supper on the table, and they ate in the comfortable way of two people who have shared a table long enough that silence is not absence but presence. After she poured coffee and sat across from him and looked at him with that direct, open look that was her truest self. "George," she said. "I know," he said, because he did know. He had known since November on the way station porch. He had perhaps known since August in the yard. "I love you," she said, with the same directness and courage she applied to everything, the clear voice of a woman who had stopped herself from saying it several times and had decided that stopping herself was not the same as being careful. It was the same as being afraid, and she had refused to be afraid of this. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I love you," he said. "Fannie. I have loved you since you put a rifle on me and gave me a direction, and every day since that has added to it until I am carrying more of it than I know what to do with." She looked at him with the smile that had started in October as a sketch and was now the whole picture, warm and real and for him. "You are doing very well with it," she said. "I have a good teacher," he said. He came around the table and she stood and he held her in the quiet kitchen of the house she had built with Thomas and defended alone and made her own, and she put her hands against his chest and leaned into him with the particular trust of a woman who has learned exactly what she is worth and is choosing to share it. "Stay," she said, into his shoulder. "I already have," he said, "months ago." The territorial inquiry began in February. It was conducted by a deputy territorial attorney named Samuel Webb, who came out from Carson City with 2 assistants, and proceeded to spend several weeks in the county records, in Redemption, and eventually at the Briggs property itself, asking questions in the polite and implacable way of a man with governmental authority, and a thoroughness that was clearly causing Callum Briggs significant discomfort. Briggs pulled his county filing on the Lockhart water rights in the 2nd week of February. He sent no official word. The filing simply disappeared from the county records as though it had never been. Helena Marsh wrote to Fannie immediately. The filing had been withdrawn. The water rights were clear. Fannie read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and put her face in her hands for a moment that was not grief, but was the release of something that had been held in the body for too long. George was there. He put his hand on her back and did not say anything, and she allowed herself 30 seconds of that, of the feeling of a weight lifted, of real space in her chest, and then she straightened and looked at the letter again. "It's over," she said. "Or at least the worst of it. The inquiry will continue," George said. "Webb seems serious about it." "I know," she picked up the letter, "but the water rights are safe." She stood up and walked to the window and looked out over her land in the February light. The land was still and cold and hers, and in the distance the 2 red rocks on the ridge sat like sentinels, and the apple trees along the south fence stood bare and patient, waiting for spring. George came and stood beside her. She reached over without looking away from the view and took his hand. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "Marry me," she said, straight and simple, the way she did everything. He turned to look at her profile and she turned to look at him, and the morning light was in her eyes, and she was 30 years old and brave and stubborn and brilliant, and the best person he had encountered in 4 years of wandering. And he was 29 years old and had been lost and had been found and was going to stay found. "Yes," he said. "God, yes." She kissed him then, properly. And it was a kiss of the same quality as everything about her, clear and direct and completely sincere. And he kissed her back with everything 4 years of drifting had been building toward without him knowing it. They were married in April of 1879. In the Redemption Church, which was a practical wooden building with 4 windows, and a congregation that was more curious than devout, but which showed up with genuine goodwill. The ceremony was performed by the Methodist minister, a Reverend Holt who had been in Redemption since before Briggs and had opinions about everyone. Fannie wore a dress of deep blue wool, because the white dress was not practical in Nevada, and practical was not something she was willing to ignore even for a wedding. She carried the 2 apple blossoms that had opened in the past week, the first blooms of the season, and she walked down the aisle of the church, and George watched her come toward him, and felt everything in him settle into a certainty, so complete, it was like coming home to a place he had not known was home. Arlo Crane was there. Helena Marsh had ridden from Carson City and sat in the second row with a small smile that acknowledged the unusual chain of events that had produced this particular ceremony. Ernest Doyle had sent a letter from Abilene that arrived the morning of the wedding, addressed to George Slater, a man who finally had the sense to stop moving, which Fannie read aloud at breakfast, and which was the best wedding gift either of them received. They said their vows with the directness that was the quality of both of them, and when Reverend Holt pronounced them married, George took her face in his hands and kissed her, and the small congregation applauded with sincerity. That spring, the territorial inquiry into Callum Briggs concluded with a formal finding of coercive land acquisition practices, spanning multiple properties over 8 years. Briggs was not arrested because the law in Nevada in 1879 did not yet have teeth sufficient for that, but he was formally censured, and his business practices were registered with the territorial government in a manner that would follow him. He sold the northern grazing land within a year and relocated to California, where he presumably found new land to acquire by methods the territory of Nevada no longer considered acceptable. Anders Holm received a copy of the territorial finding and wrote to Fannie from Oregon. She wrote back. It was a correspondence that continued for several years, two people who had experienced the same pressure, one of whom had sold and one of whom had not, and between them was no judgment, only the specific understanding of people who have been in the same storm. The spring on the Lockhart property, the Slater-Lockhart property now, though Fannie kept Lockhart in the name because Thomas had helped build it, and that deserved to be remembered, was generous that year. The apple trees along the south fence bloomed white, and the blossom smell came through the kitchen window in the mornings, and Fannie baked with the windows open, and George rebuilt the north fence entirely, and started on a plan to expand the cattle operation by 12 head. They were good together in the specific way that is better than simply happy. They worked alongside each other with the competence of two people who are both capable and who have learned to trust the other's capability. They argued sometimes because they were both strong-willed and direct, and the arguments were clean and honest and concluded without residue, because neither of them was interested in carrying things that should be put down. George took to the land with a commitment that surprised even him. He had not known he had a farmer in him, but it turned out what he had was the patience and the attention to detail that made a farmer, and those qualities had simply been wasted on drifting. He learned the water schedule and the fence rotation and the particular requirements of high desert cattle from a book Fannie gave him, and from the practical experience of doing it alongside her. And by the summer of 1879, he had opinions about the land that were not borrowed from Thomas's books but were his own. In September of 1879, Fannie told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table, over coffee, in the same direct manner she applied to important information. He was quiet for a moment, and then he came around the table and took her in his arms and held her for a long time without saying anything, because some things are bigger than words. "Are you happy?" she asked. Into his shoulder. "I am so happy," he said, "that I am having some difficulty with it." She laughed, that quick, genuine laugh. "That is a very George Slater answer." "I am a very George Slater kind of man," he said. "The baby arrived in the spring of 1880, a boy. They named him Thomas James Slater. Thomas for the man who had built the land, James for George's father, who had died in Ohio when George was 12, and whom he had not thought about in years and found he was thinking about now. The way parenthood returns you to your origins whether you are ready or not. Thomas James arrived on an April morning while Reverend Holt's wife, who was also the town's most experienced midwife, attended Fannie in the main bedroom, and George paced the kitchen with a composure he was entirely failing to maintain, and which Fannie, when it was over and she was propped up against the pillows with the baby in her arms and the color coming back into her face, found very entertaining. "You fought a man with coal oil without blinking," she said. "That was different," he said. He was standing in the doorway looking at her, and the baby with an expression he couldn't control. "Come here," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, and Thomas James looked up at him with the ancient unseeing wisdom of the newborn, and George held him with the instinctive care of a man who understands without being told that he is holding something irreplaceable. "Hello," George said to the baby, in a voice Fannie had never heard from him, soft and wondering and new. "I am going to take very good care of you. And your mother is going to take better care of you than I do, but we are both going to try our absolute best." Fannie watched them and felt something so full and complete that she had no word for it except this: "This is what I stayed for." The Slater Lockhart property expanded over the following years in the patient way of things that are built properly. A little at a time, with care, with the specific competence of two people who understand what they are building and why. By 1882, they had 40 cattle and a working arrangement with 3 other small holders in the valley for shared grazing and water access, the exact kind of cooperation that Briggs had tried to prevent because it made the individual properties stronger. George rode into Redemption regularly now as a man of the community, known and trusted. He had been asked twice to serve on the town council, which he had declined both times because council politics were not where his skills lay, but he attended the meetings and spoke when he had something to say. And when he spoke, people listened because his words were few and careful and generally correct. Arlo Crane had become a genuine friend, the kind forged through shared work and mutual respect, and the particular intimacy of men who don't talk about their feelings but who show up when it matters. He was the first one George told about Thomas James, and the first one Fannie called when the goat got into the vegetable garden and needed a more persuasive person than her to remove it from the beans. Little Thomas James grew. He walked at 11 months, talked early and constantly once he started, had his mother's dark eyes and his father's deliberate way with things physical, a child who would sit and study a fence latch for 10 minutes before deciding how it worked, and then work it perfectly on the first try. Fannie watched him with the love of a mother and the interest of a woman who had always found competence admirable in any form. In 1883, Fannie told George she was expecting again at the same kitchen table over coffee in the same direct manner as before. This time he did not have difficulty. He was already around the table before she finished the sentence. "Another one," she said into his shoulder. "Another one," he agreed. He kissed the top of her head. "Are you well?" "Better than last time," she said. "I know what it feels like now." "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "It's not the same thing." "It is in your case," he said. The second child was a girl born in the fall of 1883. They named her Clara May, and she came into the world with an opinion, a loud one, and maintained it consistently thereafter. Where Thomas James was patient and deliberate, Clara May was immediate and assertive, pulling herself up to standing before she was supposed to, reaching for things that were too far away with the complete confidence of a person who believes that distance is merely a technical problem. Thomas James, who was 3.5, looked at her with the sober curiosity of a child who has received unexpected news about the composition of his household, and declared after careful consideration that she could stay. George, witnessing this, told the story to Fannie that evening, and they lay in the dark of their bedroom laughing in the quiet way of parents who cannot be too loud and do not need to be because they are fully, completely, privately happy. By 1885, the property was flourishing. The apple trees along the south fence had reached their full maturity and produced abundantly enough that Fannie had begun selling preserves in Redemption, which led to an arrangement with the hotel there, and eventually a small regular income separate from the cattle operation. She had also become the informal authority on land documentation in the valley, because after her experience with Briggs, several other small holders had come to her with questions about their own surveys and filings, and she had helped 3 of them find errors and correct them before those errors could become vulnerabilities. George watched her do this and loved her with the specific depth of a man who has been watching the person he loves be entirely themselves for 7 years, and has found that the love grows with the watching, that it does not diminish or flatten or become routine. It simply becomes more itself. He was walking the east fence line on a Monday morning in the spring of 1885 when Thomas James, now 5, came running out from the house in that urgent, determined way of young children carrying important information. "Papa," he called, "Mama says to come in, there is a man here." "What kind of man?" Thomas James considered this with his characteristic care. "A polite man," he said, "but Mama has her thinking face." George set down the wire cutters and went in. The man was Samuel Webb, the deputy territorial attorney who had conducted the Briggs inquiry 6 years earlier. He was in the kitchen with his hat in his hand, which was the position of a man with something to ask rather than something to impose, and Fannie was at the table with her coffee and her thinking face, which was as Thomas James had described it. "Mr. Slater," Webb said, "I apologize for arriving unannounced. I'll come to the point. There is a situation in the Northern Valley that is similar in character to the Briggs matter, a larger scale, several properties involved. The territorial attorney's office is building a case, and we need someone who can serve as a land agent and investigator, someone who understands both the legal framework and the practical operations of small holders, who has the respect of the community, and who can document practices that are occurring across multiple counties." George looked at Fannie. She was watching him with a particular expression, the one that said she had already thought about this and was waiting to hear what he thought. "I have a property to run," George said. "Yes," Webb said. "We're aware. The position would involve perhaps 2 months of field work, not consecutive over the course of the next year. The office would compensate appropriately." George looked at Fannie again. This time she almost imperceptibly nodded, and he read it correctly because in 7 years of marriage he had become fluent in Fannie's language. "I'll need to know the details," George said to Webb, "and my wife will need to know them too. This affects both of us." Webb looked at Fannie with the revised assessment of a man recalibrating his expectations. "Of course," he said, "I'd welcome Mrs. Slater's perspective. Given her own experience with the Briggs matter, she understands the patterns better than most." Fannie poured Webb a cup of coffee. "Sit down then," she said. "Tell us everything." They worked the case together, as they worked everything. Fannie's role was unofficial but essential. She corresponded with the affected property holders, most of whom were more willing to share information with another small holder than with a government attorney, and her documentation was meticulous. George rode the counties and collected evidence and filed reports to Webb, and used the skills he had built in Abilene. The listening, the pattern recognition, the ability to understand when someone was telling part of a truth and to find the rest of it. The case concluded in 1886 with a significant territorial ruling that established clearer precedent for protecting smallholder water rights across Nevada. It was, Helena Marsh wrote to Fannie, a ruling that would prevent precisely the kind of situation Callum Briggs had practiced for years. It was not dramatic. There were no gunshots and no one went to prison, and there was no headline in the Carson City paper that mentioned either George or Fannie Slater. But several families kept their land who might not have, and the legal landscape of the territory shifted a small but meaningful degree in the direction of the people who worked the land rather than the people who wanted to acquire it. Fannie kept the territorial ruling in the writing box alongside Thomas's journals and land documents. The spring of 1887 was the most beautiful George had seen in nearly 9 years on the property. He had stopped counting how many springs he had spent elsewhere, in other territories, moving through other places. This was his spring, this land, this light. The apple trees were magnificent that year, white and heavy with blossom, and the smell of them came through every window of the house, and Clara May, who was 3, wanted to live underneath them and had to be retrieved from the orchard multiple times a day. Thomas James, now 7, had decided to be a lawyer, a decision he had arrived at by observing his mother handle paperwork and his father ride with territorial attorneys, and which he announced at supper with the finality of someone who has considered the matter thoroughly. "That is a fine thing to be," Fannie said. "You'll need to be good with reading," George said. "Better than you already are." "I am already very good," Thomas James said with his father's self-possession. Fannie and George exchanged a look over his head that was made of everything accumulated in 9 years. The rifle on the porch, the coffee in October, the way station in November, the starlight in the hand held and the letter to Doyle and the stone marker with TL cut into it, and the blue wedding dress and the baby held and the apple blossoms in her hair at their first spring, and every morning and every evening and every fence repaired, and every argument resolved, and every letter from Anders home and every laugh. The quick, unguarded, genuine laugh that he had catalogued from the beginning. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It said everything. In the evening of that spring day, after the children were asleep, Fannie and George sat on the porch in the last of the light. The land spread out before them, their land, 240 acres of high desert that had been fought for and held and had grown around them the way a home does when you commit to it with everything you have. The 2 red rocks on the ridge caught the last sun. The apple trees along the south fence held their blossoms in the still air. "George," she said. "Yes." "Do you remember the day you rode in?" "Every detail," he said. "You had flour on your face and a rifle on me." "You were very calm," she said, "for a man with a gun on him." "I was terrified," he said. "I just didn't know what else to do except be calm." She turned to look at him. "Why did you stay that first night, honestly?" He thought about it. He had thought about it many times over the years, the actual honest answer to that question, because it was the kind of question that deserved an actual honest answer. "Because you were the most alive person I had seen in 4 years," he said. "Even with the fury and the exhaustion and the weight of everything you were carrying. There was more life in you than I had seen anywhere since I left Kansas. And I think somewhere underneath all the reasons I gave myself, I knew that if I rode away from that, I would be riding away from the best thing I was ever going to encounter." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you didn't ride away." "So am I," he said, "every single day." She reached over and took his hand. Her hand, the hand that had held the rifle and the documentation and the baby and the apple blossoms, and his, her hand in his in the spring evening on the porch of the home they had made and were making. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Something I have been thinking about for a while." "Tell me," he said. "I was not going to survive him," she said, meaning Briggs, meaning the 17 months. "Not by losing. I was not going to lose the property, but I was going to be ground down to something less than myself. I could feel it happening, each incident taking a little more." She paused. "And then you rode in and asked which direction redemption was, and I gave you a direction and you didn't go. And it was not just that you helped. It was that you looked at me and saw a person who was still fully there, and that reminded me that I was." He looked at her. The last light was in her hair and her eyes were steady and open and entirely true. "You were always fully there," he said. "You never stopped being, you just needed someone who could see it." "You saw it," she said. "I saw it the first morning," he said. "I have never stopped seeing it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat in the quiet together, the way you sit when you have made something real and lasting and are simply in the presence of it. In 1889, Nevada became the 36th state of the United States of America. It was something Thomas Lockhart had believed would happen before he died, had said so to Fannie in the early years, and she had written it down in her own journal, the small private one she had kept since his death. Thomas said Nevada will be a state before we are old. He was right. The statehood celebration in Redemption was the largest gathering the town had seen, with a brass band brought from Carson City, and a pageant organized by the school and a bonfire that could be seen from the ridge. Thomas James, 9 years old, stood with his father in the crowd and asked careful questions about what statehood meant legally, and George answered all of them seriously because his son's questions deserved serious answers. Clara May, 6 years old and entirely herself, danced near the bonfire with 3 other girls from her schoolroom until Fannie retrieved her, and protested the retrieval with the full force of her considerable personality. George stood with Fannie when the state flag was raised, the Nevada flag silver and blue, and the crowd applauded and the brass band played and the night was full of firelight and voices, and he looked at his wife beside him, the woman who had given him a direction when he was lost and had then given him everything that followed from it, and he was grateful in a way that had no ceiling, no limit, no end that he could see. 36, she said. Nevada is a state. Thomas would have been very pleased, George said. He would have been insufferably pleased, she said. He would have said he knew it all along. He did know it all along. Yes, she said, he did. And the smile she gave was warm and clear, and carried Thomas Lockhart with the love that does not diminish when someone is gone but becomes something you carry well, like a good compass, always there, always pointing true. By 1891, the Slater-Lockhart property had a reputation in the Northern Valley as one of the best-managed small operations in the region. George had been asked 3 times to speak at the county agricultural meeting, which he had done once, briefly, about water management practices in high desert conditions. Fannie had been asked to join the newly formed Nevada Women's Suffrage Association and had joined, contributing the specific value of a woman who could organize a campaign with the precision of someone who had once organized the defense of her own land against a systematic adversary. The children grew. Thomas James was 12 by then, and was reading law books from Carson City that Helena Marsh sent him with notes in the margins. Clara May was 8 and had decided, after long consideration, to be a doctor, a decision she had arrived at by asking what it meant that she could not go to medical school and being told that it was not common and replying that she intended to change that, which she stated without drama, as though it were simply the next thing to accomplish. George told Fannie that evening, in bed in the dark, that Clara May was going to change something. He said it with certainty. "She is going to change several things," Fannie said. "She comes by it naturally. From you," he said. "From both of us," she said. "You changed things too, you just did it quietly. The quiet ones get it done," he said. She laughed in the dark. On a morning in the spring of 1892, George woke early and went out before breakfast and walked the property line, the whole perimeter, a thing he did every few months because it kept the land real beneath his feet, and because he liked the early light on the high desert, the specific quality of it, the way it arrived clean and cold and made everything sharp and clear. He walked east to the northeast corner where the Old Man Formation stood against the ridge and where, 3 feet down, a limestone slab bore the initials TL on its south face. He stood there in the spring morning and looked at the land that stretched away to the south, the apple trees just beginning to show their first leaves, the house with its smoke rising, the barn where the horses were starting to shift with morning restlessness. He could hear, distantly, the sound of Fannie in the kitchen, could see the light in the window. He had ridden into that yard with a useless map and a dry throat and a question, and she had aimed a rifle at his heart and given him a direction, and he had never taken a step away from that direction in all the years since, because the direction she had given him was not just north toward redemption. It was the direction of a life that meant something. It was the direction of a home. It was the direction of a woman who knew exactly who she was and had looked at him across a kitchen table and decided he was worth knowing. He had been a drifter. He had been lost in the particular way of a man who does not know he is lost because movement feels enough like purpose until it doesn't. He had ridden into a yard and stopped and asked one question and received one answer and had not moved since. Not away, only forward. He turned and walked back toward the house, toward the light in the window, toward the smoke rising in the spring air, toward the sound of Fannie's voice as she called the children to breakfast. He walked with the deliberate and particular joy of a man who knows exactly where he is and precisely where he is going and is glad, with every step, of both things. He opened the door and came into the kitchen warm. Clara May was already at the table with a book propped against the jam jar, which was not allowed at breakfast, and which she was hoping no one would notice. Thomas James was slicing bread with the careful competence that was entirely his own. Fannie was at the stove. She heard him come in and turn just for a moment, and the look she gave him was the look of 9 years of mournings, of everything that had grown between the rifle and this kitchen, of a love that had begun in challenge and defiance and had become the center of both their lives. "You walk the perimeter," she said. "Northeast corner," he said. "Marker solid." "It always is," she said. She turned back to the stove. "Sit down. It's getting cold." He sat down at the table with his children and his wife in the kitchen of the home they had built and were building still, in the state of Nevada in the spring of 1892, and he thought. I stopped to ask directions. She gave me one, and I never took another step away. And every year and every season and every morning of every day that came after proved that right.